cooperation. My name is Missy Ryan. I'm a reporter with the Washington Post and I cover the Pentagon. And I'm very pleased to be here today with Ms. Dana Struhl, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, with Brigadier General Duke Pirak, Deputy Director of Strategy, Plans and Policy at CENTCOM, and Mr. Bilal Saab, who is Senior Fellow and Founding Director of the Defense and Security Program here at the Middle East Institute. And I think we're going to have a really lively discussion today. We're going to take about 45 minutes for some introductory remarks from the panelists, and then we're going to have some moderated Q&A among us before I open it up at about 12 o'clock for audience Q&A. So you can submit your questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we look forward to hearing thoughts from those who are participating remotely. So let's just get it started, and we're going to start with Dana for some opening remarks.
Great. Good morning and good afternoon to those of you in the region. Thanks so much for tuning in. And thank you to MEI for the opportunity to participate in the inaugural Lebanon Policy Conference. I am always glad to connect with MEI, and it is a pleasure to join you today. So before I talk specifically about Lebanon, I'd like to just zoom out and talk a little bit about the Department of Defense and the Biden administration and its approach to the Middle East. And I want to do that by reading two lines from the March 2021 Interim National Security Strategy that was released by the White House. The first sentence I'd like to read is, "Our aim will be to de-escalate regional tensions and create space for people throughout the Middle East to realize their aspirations." And then the second sentence I want to highlight, "We will work with our regional partners to deter Iranian aggression and threats to sovereignty and territorial integrity, disrupt al-Qaeda and related terrorist networks, and prevent an ISIS resurgence, address humanitarian crises, and redouble our efforts to resolve the complex armed conflicts that threaten regional stability." The most important thing I want to communicate today is that as the DASD for the Middle East in the Pentagon, my first job is to support the State Department and the diplomats in resolving what takes place across the Middle East and figuring out political processes and ways of bringing people together to sustain long-term solutions to the region's problems. There is no military solution to the region's problems. So given that framework, the approach of the Biden administration broadly to the Middle East is de-escalation of the extremely tense situation across the region. There's multiple deadly conflicts, increased Iranian aggression following the maximum pressure campaign, ongoing governments who are not delivering sustainable solutions for their people. Against this backdrop, we in the administration are emphasizing diplomacy and the work of diplomats operating from a foundation of strength, which the Department of Defense provides. Given that, I'd like to speak a little bit about where we are today with the Lebanese Armed Forces, or the LAF. The end of the Syrian military occupation of Lebanon in 2005 provided a strategic opportunity for the United States to increase bilateral engagement with Lebanon while making a concerted effort to strengthen Lebanon's sovereignty and stability, to include in particular supporting the LAF. Since 2006, the United States invested approximately $2.5 billion in building the capabilities of the LAF. Throughout this period, Lebanon has been beset by a wide range of security and economic challenges. As a result of the conflict next door in Syria, Lebanon faced an influx of more than 1 million Syrian refugees, as well as deadly incursions across its borders from the Islamic State. In late 2019, the Lebanese people rose in protest against the country, calling for Lebanon's leaders to deliver on their promises for reforms and to provide basic services to the population. This past year has been especially challenging for security governance in Lebanon. In addition to enduring challenges associated with the COVID-19 pandemic and the August 2020 explosion at the port of Beirut, Lebanon has witnessed the steep devaluation of public sector budgets and wages. For the LAF and other security services, this means that their operational demands have increased even as the purchasing power of their budgets has collapsed. Now, I want to reference back to my initial remarks from the Interim National Security Strategy. What the Biden administration is saying is that there is no unilateral fix and there is no military solution to the region's challenges. What we can do is invest in partners and alliances to help shape shared whole of government responses when it comes to humanitarian situations, hosting refugees, response to the COVID-19 pandemic, response to the severe humanitarian crisis in Lebanon. In all of these respects, the LAF remains a partner for the United States. So with U.S. partnership, the LAF has performed admirably in addressing these challenges. They continue to conduct effective counterterrorism and border security operations that have significantly diminished the ISIS presence in Lebanon since 2017. With some exceptions, the LAF has demonstrated professionalism and respect for human rights when charged with protecting peaceful demonstrators at large-scale protests. The LAF distributed humanitarian support to the Lebanese people following the Port of Beirut explosion and in support of COVID-19 relief activities. For this and other reasons, we believe the LAF maintains the confidence of a broad segment of the Lebanese population. However, we're also planning for significant challenges on the horizon. The country's political leadership has so far failed to enact the kind of reforms that can put the country on more stable footing. And until they do, we remain concerned about the course of the economic crisis in the country. And I know the MEI conference discussed many of these issues last week. Even as the LAF is being called upon to maintain stability and respond to the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Lebanon, its soldiers are also feeling the impact of the crisis as they see the value of their salaries drop by nearly 90%. We remain concerned about Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon. As we have said many times, Hezbollah's terrorist and illicit activities threaten Lebanon's security, stability, and sovereignty. It is more concerned with its own interests than what is best for the Lebanese people. And that's why it is important that the Lebanese people can count on the LAF to act in the interest of the nation. The Lebanese people deserve a security force that supports the stability and prosperity of the Lebanese people and that behaves responsibly with respect to Lebanon's neighbors. The administration remains keenly interested in Lebanon's stability. And as a result, we are committed to working with the LAF to find ways to bolster them in this time of crisis. Just this month, the Department of Defense initiated the provision of $59 million in Section 1226 funding to the LAF as reimbursement for security upgrades at the border and operations along Lebanon's border with Syria. DoD also announced that it will donate 3 U.S. Coast Guard Protector class patrol boats to the LAF Navy next year. These boats will greatly strengthen Lebanon's maritime patrol capabilities. In addition, the Department of State announced the intent to provide $120 million in foreign military financing for fiscal year 2021, marking a $15 million increase over prior year levels. This military grant assistance will provide the LAF with critical defense systems, services, and training. We continue to explore other ways to provide additional assistance to the LAF at this challenging time for Lebanon. Thanks for allowing me to start, and I look forward to your questions and the rest of this panel.
Thanks, Dana. General, why don't you go ahead with your introductory remarks?
Thank you very much, Missy. First off, I also want to take a moment to say thank you for moderating this panel. And thank you to our host, Middle East Institute, my good friend, Bilal Saab, for giving us the opportunity to discuss security cooperation efforts with the Lebanese Armed Forces. Also, I want to say thank you to Dasdi Stroll. It's a pleasure to see you, Dana. Actually, I thought Dana's comments were, the military assessments she offered were absolute spot on, and actually don't have a lot to add in terms of some of the details there. So I will greatly shorten my opening comments and just offer a few observations from a military standpoint. So thank you, Dana. That was outstanding. As I'm sure you're all tracking, United States Central Command works very hard to ensure a strong relationship with the LAF, as Dana said, who is really operating under incredibly difficult conditions right now. We do believe that the LAF provides a steadying force in Lebanon. We believe that LAF has the support of the majority of the population and does stand for the principles of democracy, and again, has behaved admirably under very, very difficult conditions there. I do appreciate Dana making the distinction, of course, that the LAF is not Hezbollah. Hezbollah certainly has a nefarious influence within Lebanon, but I have to tell you, we see very little risk of our efforts in terms of security assistance support to the LAF bleeding over to Hezbollah, and I look forward to perhaps expanding on that later on in the discussion there. We do see LAF as providing a viable security alternative to Lebanese Hezbollah and has shown a potential to be the sole security provider in Lebanon. That's why we'd like to continue to mature that relationship and their capability. Central Command security cooperation activities focus on supporting the continued development of the LAF and the capable, competent, reliable security force, mostly based on the principles of supporting territorial integrity, sovereignty, that which is basic to supporting the nation state. We believe the LAF is a security partner of choice and continue to invest in the strategic partnership. I really can't give up the microphone without emphasizing a point that Dana made, that that the dire situation that Lebanese certainly faces in the Lebanese Armed Forces, in particular the individual soldiers, with truly the value of their salaries and their buying power dropping significantly there. Despite these incredibly difficult situations there, we've seen a Lebanese Armed Forces that have acted very responsibly in very, very difficult conditions there. We absolutely believe that that's owed in part to the relationship that we have developed over time with coaching and mentoring the LAF to be that responsible actor and security provider in Lebanon. And we think that's truly a byproduct and the value of our engagement there. Dana talked about most of our efforts. I will want to expand perhaps on some of them later. I do have late breaking news. I just got the outbrief of Resolute Union 21, which was a complex air, land, and sea exercise, complex multinational and joint exercise. And from our staff in Lebanon, the word is that the LAF was an outstanding professional participant, most engaged, and in the largest and most complex exercise in the history to take place in Lebanon there. So I think that very good news here. I look forward to getting additional details later. But the fact that this type of exercise is going on and we're able to exercise this partnership despite the conditions is proof positive of the LAF being a responsible actor in a relationship we'd like to continue to mature. Missy, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. Bilal, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Missy. Really is a pleasure to be on a call with two old friends and former colleagues I respect deeply. First, I want to say that we should all welcome and even demand a higher level of scrutiny when it comes to U.S. military assistance, not just to Lebanon, but to any other recipient of Title 10 and Title 22 money. At the end of the day, this is really U.S. taxpayer money, and it's our responsibility and no one else's to make sure it's generating the outcomes that we're asking it to generate. Of course, my hope is that this attitude and determination to monitor, assess, and evaluate what we're doing in Lebanon also applies just as much to other military assistance programs in the region, especially those in Egypt and Jordan, which are much larger than the one in Lebanon. But we're not talking about Jordan and Egypt right now. So that's point number one. Point number two I want to make is that any attempt really at evaluating our military assistance to Lebanon must be preceded by just a crystal clear understanding of what we're trying to achieve in Lebanon with that assistance and what is it really that we are evaluating. Let's not compare apples and oranges. Point number three I want to make is that any objective and really useful evaluation ought to appreciate just how truly atypical, extraordinary this program is. And I'm not talking about the outcomes or the results. I'll explain that in a minute. We may be providing training and equipment to the LAF that's in many respects similar to others in the region. We may be trying to achieve some counterterrorism objectives in Lebanon that are also similar to other places. But by God, the enormity of the country's structural problems and the very different, I would say, overall objective we have in Lebanon with this assistance should be very clearly understood. We just cannot compare what we're trying to do in Lebanon with what we're trying to do, say, in Egypt, Oman, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, or anywhere else. So why is this really a special or atypical military assistance program? Well, because at the end of the day, unlike other programs, we're not really trying to politically support the country's rulers. We're not trying to gain major access over flight and basing like we do in other places, although we do need some access with some units of the LAF, including the SOF. Instead, our assistance to the LAF at the end of the day is an act of, you could call it a deliberate political subversion of our adversaries. And those adversaries back in the day, that was the Syrians until 2005 when they left. And since then, it's of course Iran and Hezbollah. Nowhere in the region do we face such internal and external challenges like we do in Lebanon. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, even though Lebanon has to deal with Sunni jihadists, right? Especially with the rise of ISIS in more recent years. Nevertheless, the principal security threats, as very correctly articulated by Dana and others, about which we are concerned, are Hezbollah and Iran, okay? Our hope is, with our assistance, we will help the LAF covertly, overtly, at least contain these problems. And frankly, any other assessment of US motivations in Lebanon would be naive or worse, dishonest. But let me be very clear. This is in no way meant to suggest that our assistance to Lebanon is seeking to empower the LAF to take on Hezbollah militarily. That would be absurd and self-defeating. This is like us deciding to build up the Iraqi military back in the 1990s so that one day they could take on Saddam's Republican Guard. That's not what we're trying to do in Lebanon, right? So we're modestly, patiently arming and training the LAF, because should the issue of Hezbollah's arms one day be resolved through international diplomacy or, God forbid, regional war, at least we have something to fall back on, some kind of an infrastructure, some kind of a professional army to take on, assume its national defense responsibilities across the country. That is what you call long-term planning, and that's a good thing. Now, this is all so damn hard because, like in the 80s, when for a brief moment we tried to rebuild the Lebanese army in the most chaotic, violent circumstances during that country's civil war, when the Israelis had a presence, the Syrians had a presence, pretty much everybody had a presence in Lebanon. It is very hard because the project of rebuilding the LAF at the time was the only game in town we had to preserve our influence in the country. Let me offer you a quote from Leslie Brown, at the time a State Department official, who said in the 80s that when it came to Lebanon, quote, "We didn't have a choice. The concept was that the success of the whole Lebanese operation was dependent on the successful reconstruction of the Lebanese army," end quote. 40 years later, we're back to that situation. And it's not because of us, not because of anything we did wrong. It's just because the situation in Lebanon really hasn't changed. As a matter of fact, it's gotten worse. If the LAF collapses, to a large extent, so will our position and influence in the country. And here I would invite anybody who has an interest in Lebanon or in the region to honestly, ideally, professionally debate what that really means, and importantly, whether we can afford to lose Lebanon. The people are going to have different opinions about this and different assessments and almost polar opposites. Some will say the price is inflated or exaggerated and that we have more important priorities to worry about. Others will not agree with that assessment. And I think two of them are with us on this panel. Frankly, I'm somewhere in the middle. You know, we're not that overly invested in Lebanon anyway. So I'd rather stay involved with our modest level of investment and reap the fruits of that investment, because they are not insignificant, as Duke and Dana have mentioned. I'd rather do that than divest, frankly, and leave and suffer the consequences. The 1 minute I have left, I just want to make a final point that looks at our assistance to Lebanon from a broader perspective, in some ways offer an optimistic note. If we can make it in Lebanon, and we have to a large extent, we can make it almost anywhere. The enormity of the structural problems we have in Lebanon and that the LAF has had to deal with, the political failure, the economic collapse, so on and so forth, everything we've been talking about for the past few days, and the presence of a military actor that answers to no one but a foreign player, that's Iran, makes it almost miraculous that we were able to accomplish so much with such a little investment. In a matter of 10 years, and Duke will tell you this, and probably even less, we essentially were able to transform the LAF from a decrepit force, mocked by its regional peers, to a professional military that has earned the respect of CENTCOM's leadership. Our training and equipment has allowed the LAF, like very few others in the region, to engage in what we call combined arms. So basically integrating air and ground assets. Very few people, very few armies do that in the region. Of course, the Emiratis are one of them, the Jordanians to some extent. But Lebanon was able to demonstrate that in Fajr Jarud in ways that are almost near Western standards. And of course, once again, Duke can tell you more about that. So I would say this, let's protect our investment in Lebanon. It's not costing us much, and it's actually fulfilling more than we ever anticipated. For once, we're thinking long-term, not just in Lebanon, but in the wider region. And once again, that's a good thing. I'll stop here.
All right, thanks a lot. So we're gonna do some question and answer among the panelists. And I want to kick things off and direct my first question to you, Bilal, actually. And I think it would be helpful for the discussion to start with a question that really gets to the heart of the controversy and the discussion around security cooperation with Lebanon, especially outside of the Middle East security cooperation community, and the topic that gets a lot of attention on Capitol Hill. And that is the relationship between the LAF and Hezbollah. So can you give us your assessment and just sort of flesh out for the audience, how do you see the evolving LAF-Hezbollah relationship, and what is it realistic to ask Lebanese leaders to do and authorize vis-a-vis that relationship?
Yeah, sure. Why don't we just tackle that issue head on? Because you're absolutely right. This is by far the most complicated, controversial issue in our assistance there. So I would say the best way to describe the relationship is one of deconfliction, right? And I think we saw that on the ground, practically speaking, during Fajr al-Jarud in 2017, but also in previous battles in 2007 in Al-Barid, right? Where you're starting to see some independent decision-making, independent actions taken by the LAF that in many ways were frankly against the interests of Hezbollah. Nevertheless, the LAF went on about its business, did its duties, and performed them admirably in 2017. And if you recall, Missy, for both operations, so I'm going to limit that to these two, at least since the Syrians left, because this is when the LAF really started to gain some independence, right? Because before that, really it was not. It was pretty much co-opted by the Syrians. So after 2005, with 07, Al-Barid, 2017, a decade later with Fajr al-Jarud, those two battles, Hezbollah had deep concerns about the LAF getting involved in them. And it's not because they had a good relationship with the Sunni jihadists, obviously. It's because they were worried about the LAF earning greater respect amongst Lebanese society and becoming a little bit more independent in ways that would sort of at least challenge their own autonomy and their own operations in the south, and so on and so forth. The fact that the LAF went about its business in both operations against the wishes of Hezbollah tells you that there's a degree of independence between the two that is quite real. I'm sure Dana and Duke can tell you more about this, but we have our own system of ensuring that all the weapons that we provide to the LAF in no ways end up in the hands of Hezbollah. We have strict controls there when end-use monitoring. We have our Golden Century model, which the LAF obviously has a very high record on, and consistently. The LAF itself does a lot of strict vetting in terms of its own personnel. And as the higher you go up, the more elevated the status of personnel, the stricter the vetting, which means that they are actually not under the influence of Hezbollah and much more under the control of the army's leadership. At the end of the day, as you said yourself, Missy, this is a very difficult situation because they share the same territory and it's a tiny country, right? So what can we expect the most out of them is to continue doing joint patrols, whether it's with UNIFIL or themselves along the south, continue to secure the borders along Syria, counter the smuggling, go after narco-terrorism, which the LAF has never done throughout its history. They've had two very major successful operations in the summer of 2018 that went against some, I'm going to call them superstar narco-terrorists in the Bekaa, that were very much against the interests of Hezbollah. And they were quite a shock actually to Hezbollah that they were able to perform so competently and go after them so aggressively. So with the strict vetting, with the end-use monitoring, with the independent actions that go against Hezbollah's interests, you could sort of flesh out a conclusion here that there is a very real independent relationship that goes on between the two, but it certainly has limits and is limited to deconfliction more than anything else.
Missy, may I just for
Sure, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I just to back up what Bilal is saying there. Look, being responsible for this for my CENTCOM folks that are operating in Lebanon, there are very strict conditions for our support as codified in both law and policy. And when those conditions change, the support gets cut off. So I too share Bilal's confidence in our mechanisms for in-use monitoring and whatnot, and I do appreciate the vetting there. That's not something that we sort of assume is just going on and it's operating on its own. We continue to validate the integrity of these systems to ensure that we're being good stewards of taxpayer dollars. But I know that Bilal and I have had this conversation before. When you talk security cooperation, naturally, this faces a tremendous amount of scrutiny, regardless of what the partner country is. And I think that's welcome scrutiny. That's important. It's important that we be able to explain the story. What is the value of this assistance? But Congress has established some fairly strict guidelines and assessment, monitoring, and evaluation, which we've incorporated to ensure that we're getting our value from this. And when we're not, we understand that money is going to be cut off there. There is one aspect of this assessment, though, that is difficult to measure, and that is the perhaps soft power value to this type of engagement here. So you have dollars put into partner X, which we'd like to see produce result Y in terms of actual capability and what we call building partner capacity. But there's also this value of the mill-to-mill engagement. This partnership, this coaching, this mentoring that happens through these engagements, these transactions here, which hopefully over time generates, a more mature, responsible partner. The difficulty, of course, is those things are measured best in hindsight, perhaps after 10 years of this kind of partnership there. It's very difficult to see how money spent within 1 year achieves this result. It's really an assessment that's done over time. And the assessment, my military assessment of what we've been able to do in Lebanon, given all these conditions, is very positive.
Great. Well, thanks, Duke. I appreciate that. I definitely want to get back to the question of vetting and end-use monitoring if we have time. I think it's a really important one. But the next question that I want to ask is for you, Dana, and you mentioned in your opening remarks the magnitude of the economic crisis that Lebanon is facing right now and the impact on the LAF. We saw last week General Aoun in France seeking assistance and warning of collapse. I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit more about how the extreme conditions are affecting the LAF's ability to conduct the role that we hope it will have in Lebanon, and how that is shaping the thinking of the Pentagon in terms of the security cooperation relationship.
Sure, that's an excellent question. So first of all, just to broaden back out again, the United States does not give assistance or do these partnerships out of the goodness of our hearts, right? We are looking for capable, committed partners who share our security goals. With the LAF, as Bilal talked about the history here, we are interested in developing a long-term partnership with an institution that responds to the Lebanese people, is committed to what's in their interest, and is a national representative institution to provide an alternative to Lebanese Hezbollah. Why are people looking to Hezbollah either for security in southern Lebanon or even for things like COVID-19 pandemic response? Because the state has not provided a dignified alternative to Lebanese Hezbollah, right? So in DoD, we can look at it from the security side, but there's a whole of government approach here. And what we do in the security cooperation realm with the LAF has to fit into that broader narrative. Now, when we talk about security cooperation in our interest, it's not just to be invested in the relationship for the sake of the relationship. It's because we want a security partner that shares our objectives and is going to go at them so that the United States doesn't do it itself all over the Middle East or frankly, globally. So when it comes to the LAF, are they still committed to border security? Are they still committed to counterterrorism? And right now, what we're seeing that is remarkable, but I think is very much a strain on the LAF, is their willingness to step in and provide some humanitarian response, humanitarian distribution at the very local level. So I want to, one thing that General Pirak said that was really important was about Operation Resolute Union, where despite the economic strain, despite the multiple ways in which the LAF is being asked to respond far beyond its writ in terms of what a traditional military or conventional military should do, it still participated in this incredibly impressive exercise with us. And we've seen them continue to maintain commitment to counterterrorism, to border security, despite the fact that the the real value of a salary of a LAF soldier and what that salary means for the family that LAF soldier supports is diminishing every single day. And so this again is a partner that's maintained focus to their mission and to our shared security objectives, despite the pressures on not just the LAF, but as a reflection of the broader Lebanese economy and social tensions.
Great, thanks very much. And just building on that, Duke, the next question is for you. And given the extraordinary circumstances and the real deprivation that we're seeing across Lebanese society, and the upheaval in governance and services and all of that, what is your expectation in terms of the LAF's capability to handle another major operation like Dawn of the Outskirts or Nahal al-Bared in these circumstances? How is that affecting their operational capability? And a corollary to that is if you could provide us an assessment of the threat level from ISIS or Al-Qaeda in northern Lebanon, that would be helpful, I think, for the audience.
Thank you, Missy. Appreciate it. Just kind of building also off of Dana's comments as well. I just the conditions that we're dealing with here, depending on how you measure this, with their pound losing 20% of its value from last year. Look, I can just speak to you as a military officer, maintaining focus and a formation when your soldiers are worried about really what is an existential threat to their families. If you were to use Maslow's hierarchy as a framework for thinking about this, the ultimate distraction for a service member in a complex military operation, whether it be an exercise or a live operation, is concerns about one's family and whether they are taken care of, they're fed and protected. And so, we see this even in our own formations when we have potentially an issue and we, peel the onion back and find that we potentially have problems at home and whatnot. So I only bring that up to say that, again, considering the conditions by which the LAF are operating and the distractions that they're dealing with, that they're able to operate with such professionalism. I just simply can't emphasize that enough. And so to your question, which is a good one, what is your assessment of their ability to handle things in the future? Well, I have to tell you, it's been a series of surprises in the past. And this is a organization that has been incredibly resilient. I mean, shoot, the entire country has been incredibly resilient. So I just, I guess that, I am cautiously optimistic about their ability to continue on with this resilience. But I do think it's important for us to have this conversation to ask, how long can this continue? How long can they continue to operate this way? I mean, but again, you can pump money into a partner, but what you can't buy is a sense of patriotism and pride in one's nation. And so we have elements of that here in Lebanon that are so admirable and unique in some ways, because the United States certainly provides assistance to a lot of partners out there that perhaps don't have that same sense of loyalty, I guess. And here we have the LAF operating under these very, very difficult conditions, and we're not seeing desertions. We're seeing, continued responsible behavior. Really, really admirable, and I really appreciate it.
Let me just ask you one quick, just to delve a little bit more deeply into one element of the question is, what about mounting their ability to mount urban operations as needed, which, what has been a challenge in the past? Is that something that you could provide thoughts on?
Well, I would actually say, counterterrorism specifically has been one of our primary efforts with security cooperation. And, we actually, Bilal mentioned some things in the very beginning there that we actually see them operating at a very high level of professionalism. One can imagine that over time, a financial situation is going to just start to erode at the capacity of the LAF writ large to continue to fund operations, right? And it will manifest itself in a variety of different ways. I think that, we're seeing the LAF start to boil down and focus on key aspects of key force elements within their military there that they consider to be most important for continued support to governance. But this is going to continue to be a challenge. So I would, in this forum, hesitate to say that to provide any assessments of their ability to endeavor to launch Operation X or Y in the future, because it just depends on so many variables. Depends on the decisions that are made internal to the LAF in terms of their focus and whatnot, and certainly depends on the nature of the challenge.
And before we move on, do you have a quick word about the threat from ISIS and Al-Qaeda specifically in northern Lebanon?
Well, again, in this forum, I would hesitate to get into specifics. I would say the threat is there, and we've had successes against both those organizations throughout the AOR. ISIS, as we like to say, is territorially defeated, and Iraq and Syria unable to hold a population or territory at risk. But it's a very dangerous terrorist organization that exists in hearts and minds and on the internet. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing this metastasization in other parts of the world. And so it's something we really need to maintain focus on there. So it's certainly present. It is a threat. But we have enjoyed a fantastic partnership with the LAF, and we've been able to keep those threats at bay in Lebanon.
I have another question for Bilal about the U.S. political context, but before we move on, another question for you, Duke, and for Dana, if you either of you want to jump in. As we were talking about this, it occurred to me that across the Middle East, one possible comparison is the U.S. relationship with the Iraqi security forces, and the fact that we're supporting this. We have this very important security relationship with this crucial security player in the country. But at the same time, we seek to, wall off our relationship and our support from other security actors in the country, namely the Iran-backed militias in Iraq. And I'm just wondering if either of you could talk about, how is the Lebanese context different? And I think a lot of our audience members will be very familiar with, how the Iraqi, the tensions in that relationship have manifest since ISIS, certainly in 2014, and maybe some differences or comparisons might be helpful for the conversation.
Sure, I'll start. So first of all, we're present in much larger numbers in Iraq, and we're there because the Iraqi government invited the United States to be present because ISIS seized massive territory, was terrorizing local communities, committed genocide, et cetera, et cetera. So not only that, so first of all, we remain present, U.S. forces under a named command, present inside Iraqi bases, actively training, advising, assisting Iraqi security forces to take the fight to one security objective, which is defeat ISIS, right? So that's what we're doing. Number two, from a security cooperation perspective, another element that makes it different is we have a specific funding authority that allows us to cooperate with the Iraqi security forces and then the Peshmerga under its CTEF. So with the CTEF authority, we can purchase equipment in a different way, still, of course, subject to congressional oversight, but a 2-year authority, very, very different. So let me just say that those are the ways in which it's different. In Lebanon, we don't have U.S. forces under a separate command. We have U.S. forces present in an Office of Security Cooperation that's under the Chief of Mission Authority. We continue to do security assistance and security cooperation, but under existing regular authorities. So I talked about foreign military financing. We have other kinds of things like Section 1226, border security, et cetera. Ways in which it's similar. End use monitoring, oversight, both in policy and in statute requirements to make sure that our security partners are protecting human rights, respecting the rule of law, civ-mil relations, responsible to their governments, et cetera. These are the ways in which it is similar. So in terms of congressional concern, and frankly, as a policy matter, making sure that the equipment that we divest to our partners, that they remain focused on shared security objectives, et cetera, those are very similar. We need to make sure that the equipment that we sell or divest is being used responsibly against shared security objectives, not against citizens, Iraqi citizens or Lebanese citizens, and that the equipment is not subject to adversary access, so Iran or Lebanese Hezbollah. One way in which I think there is a parallel is that we are seeing political parties who are backed by, funded by, trained by, assisted by Iran, an adversary, more active in the governing structures of both countries, and that these actors are not just political parties, but they also have armed military wings, and nothing about their decision-making suggests that they are taking actions in the interest of either the Lebanese people or the Iraqi people. So when you see Lebanese Hezbollah make certain actions or the Iraqi PMF take certain actions, they're undermining the security, the safety, stability, and sovereignty of Iraqi citizens and Lebanese citizens. So what is similar here is that our security assistance and our security cooperation is intended to build resilient national representative institutions that will be responsive to the needs and desires of their citizens. So that is the overall objective. But again, very different context, because in Iraq, territory was actually seized by ISIS. That did not happen in Lebanon. Different funding, different authorities, different flexibility. But what remains the same, I would say, is one is the United States is interested in building national, representative, resilient institutions responsive to the needs of their citizens. And we maintain a high priority on end use monitoring, understanding that and ensuring that our equipment and our training and advising and assistance is used in the interest of the people of those countries and is not misused or accessed by adversaries.
Great. Duke, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would. I have to tell you that Ms. Stroll's perfect articulation is making my job incredibly easy. So I really appreciate this. So Dana, spot on with all. I just would add, operating in Iraq, Lebanon, obviously vastly different conditions and authorities and whatnot. So the key aspect there, of course, being a named operation, our presence there, of which now in Iraq is largely enabling and advising. We're not actually going out doing partnered operations there, which again, I think is proof positive of the results of our years-long effort to develop the Iraqi security forces, another partnership we very much enjoy there. I will tell you, Ms. Stroll mentioned the CTEF fund. CTEF very often gets, sort of the view of CTEF and security cooperation gets somewhat convoluted at times. And I would just not to be too much of a technocrat here at this point, but
can you just
CTEF
say what that stands for? Tell the audience what that stands for.
It's the counter ISIS training equip fund.
Thanks.
And CTEF was designed to be responsive to a Title X warfighting headquarters. So CTEF, by and large, the reporting for that goes through the CJTF OIR commander, Lieutenant General Calvert, and then is partially facilitated here by CENTCOM. And as Dana mentioned, CTEF has incredible latitude within that fund to sort of support, I would say, more basic blocking and tackling types of things, supporting the ISF, like ammunition, things of that nature. It is not a strategic fund. Security cooperation is more on the strategic side. And so CTEF is not a neoclassic security cooperation effort. The reason all of that matters is, as Dana said, when we're focused on the long term in Lebanon, we're focused on planning for strategic lines of effort with an incredible amount of lead time necessary to support the same. So, we're planning now for operations and activities in the 23-24 timeframe there, best case, if they compete for when the funds are within our corporate process there. And so we don't have access to a CTEF fund for Lebanon specifically to get after some of the very basic needs of the LAF.
Okay, great, thanks. Bilal, before we try to take some questions from the audience, another question for you is, can you talk, going back to the debate about support for the LAF and the role of Hezbollah, can you talk a little bit about the evolving politics of this whole discussion in the United States, and how the conversation about Iran and affects that?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I think the politics are a little bit more, well, actually a lot more favorable. I think they're a lot more nuanced. The attitude at the time during the Trump administration was less amenable to continuing the assistance to the LAF because they viewed it from the prism of the maximum pressure campaign. The first question that you asked, Missy, was very much on the minds of US officials at the time, that Hezbollah was very much influential, had a lot of influence over the LAF, and therefore they had significant concerns about continuing the assistance. We've already discussed that in this forum. I think that there's a different attitude with this administration. Moreover, what the United States is doing with Iran right now is drastically different from what the Trump administration did before. Obviously, there's an ongoing dialogue, and therefore that in many ways diffuses the tension or de-escalates, as the word that Dana uses in her remarks. So I'm not going to say that it's an entirely different ballgame, but it's a very different situation. And whatever concerns that were communicated in the previous administration, they haven't evaporated, I would say, but they certainly have subsided with this one. With your permission, Missy, I have a very quick comment I want to say about the ability of the LAF to pursue operations, let's say in another Palestinian refugee camp, should that contingency arise, because I think it's a really an important one, right? So long story short, and I'm just going to second what Duke said. Long story short, obviously it depends on the nature of the enemy and circumstances and so on and so forth. But one thing about the LAF is that this is really one of the armies in the region that is a learning army. They really know how to learn from past experiences. And because of a long-term process that we've engaged in with the LAF that helps them build not just train and equip, but also build their institutional capacities, right? In other words, like they're able to sustain whatever we provide them, despite the horrendous financial and economic conditions of the country. That in many ways puts them in a better position to handle whatever contingencies that might arise in the future. That is one thing that the LAF does so well, and I would argue does it better than anybody else in the region, which is to build capacity in order to sustain the stuff that we give it and the advice that we give it. So let me just stop there.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to take a question. Just want to remind everybody, if you do have a question, you can type it in the Q&A screen at the tab at the bottom of your screen, and then we can get it to the panelists. So there's a question here from Maher Azadine, and he's asking about China and Russia, saying China and Russia are trying to rewrite the rules of the road vis-a-vis air, land, sea, cyberspace, and relating that to Lebanon. And so I think the question is sort of what is the US position on competition with China and Russia as it relates to Lebanon. And that sort of actually is related to a question that I have on my list of things to ask you all, which is, how does security cooperation with Lebanon, how should we think about that as the US moves towards great power competition? So if Dana or Duke, you want to answer those, that would be great.
Sure, I'll start by just addressing China. So this administration has defined China as the pacing threat or pacing challenge globally. So what we need to do in the CENTCOM and Middle East policy space is think through what it means for China to be the pacing threat in the Middle East space. And there I would argue that security cooperation and our security partnerships are a core area where we compete. And there, I think there's a very clear choice for partners. I think there's a notion across the region that one can have an economic relationship with China or a cyber relationship or commercial relationship, and it doesn't veer into the strategic space of the U.S. strategic partnerships. And I would encourage our partners to think twice about that. Now, everyone has an economic partnership or relationship with China. The United States has trade, has economic and commercial engagement with China, but we are very deliberate and specific and have a deliberative process here to prevent Chinese investment in certain sectors that ultimately could become a national security threat to us. And one area with which we need to work more with our partners, and this applies to Lebanon just as it does to other partners in the Middle East, is that certain types of Chinese investment or activities in countries in the region will pose a threat to U.S. protection of U.S. defense technology and to U.S. force protection. And when it comes to those issues, the United States is going to protect our own forces, our own warfighters, and our own equipment. So if we reach a point where economic relationships or military relationships or contemplation of Chinese military basing in countries poses a risk to what we want to do or our strategic partnerships, we're gonna choose to protect ourselves. And so this is going to be an ongoing dialogue, and our partners are going to hear more about it. And same thing with Russia. Russian intentions in the Middle East are to challenge United States and stress United States strategic partnerships with our partners and attempt to provide an alternative. But I would argue, and I would love to hear what General Pyrak wants to say here, there is no comparison to what the United States offers in terms of security partnership, security cooperation, the kinds of training assistance that we provide, the kind of military that our partners can become through training and exercises, professional military education, access to our war colleges, et cetera. So when a partner like the LAF make that commitment to us, what we are providing is not just equipment, not just authorities, but a holistic strategic partnership. And to me, the choice is clear between what you can get from a China or a Russia and what you can get from the United States. It also is clear that certain countries and partners will want to hedge and test what more they might be able to get from the United States by testing the waters of deeper cooperation with the Chinese or the Russians, particularly in the security and military space. And I would just caution them again that there is a point where that will tip into the strategic, that will not only threaten your partnerships with the United States, but could actually threaten your national sovereignty in countries like Lebanon. So I'll leave it there, turn it over to the other panelists.
Duke, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, really, again, very much appreciate your comments there, Dana. I totally agree. I've been asked this question several times. I certainly don't think that the person asking this question is necessarily implying this, but I've been asked about security cooperation solely for the purposes of great power competition. And I think that somewhat of a fool's errand there. I think it's security cooperation efforts are most potent, of course, when they're covering down on U.S. national interests first. And then, of course, there is an ancillary benefit that we recognize in this business of great power competition there. I will tell you that, Dana sort of alluded to it. Security cooperation, as we conduct it, as the United States conducts it, there is an impression at times from our partners that we can be somewhat late to need with material solutions. And that is just the nature of our governance, oversight, industry, planning and funding process. Where I will tell you at times, China can offer some very attractive material solutions very quickly to key partners, but those material solutions don't necessarily come with a customer care plan. And nor do they come with the much valued partnership with the United States. And so frankly, some of our partners tolerate our long lead and planning requirements for security cooperation because they know they're investing in this partnership there. And that's certainly something we like to focus on there.
Missy, can I add something to that?
Yeah, and I have a follow-up for you, Bilal.
So just in very simple terms, there are places in the region where we have very strong partners that actually not only receive our assistance, but also purchase equipment from the Chinese and have some kind of relations with the Chinese. That's not the case with Lebanon. And that's the good thing about Lebanon not having any leverage, right? So as long as we are there, as long as we are committed to that country, we should not be really worried as much about Chinese influence or Russian influence. Although, frankly, I will put the Russian above the Chinese in Lebanon because of their level of interest in expanding their presence across the Mediterranean. So the Lebanese case is really very different from others, like the UAE, like Jordan, like Egypt, where they actually have ties with the Chinese that are tangible. In Lebanon, it's aspirational. As a matter of fact, it is a consequence of our departure. So as long as we are there, we shouldn't be really worried that much.
So Bilal, my follow-up for you was actually that you related to something you just mentioned, which is Russia's ambitions in the region. And it seems, and my question is, could you say anything specific about how Russia's presence in Syria, in Tartus, the military footprint there since 2015 has affected Lebanon? Because, the larger question is about, what support China and Russia can offer these countries from afar, arms sales to Egypt from Russia, arms sales from China. But I think that having Russia right there in Syria is very different. And I'm hoping you can just answer that question really quick.
Yeah, I mean, just long story short, the Russians, if they could do it on the cheap, if we were ever to downsize or leave, if they could do it on the cheap and expand their presence in the Levant and in the Mediterranean on the southern flank of NATO, why not? But as far as the Chinese are concerned, I mean, Lebanon is in no position to buy anything from them, and they don't have the money. And so if they're looking for that transactional, approach, Lebanon is in no way, a position to buy any drones or any other equipment. Now, Might there be any investments in the port and other places? Sure, but the Chinese are not stupid. They realize that there's a political class in the country that is deeply corrupt, that's probably not going to honor agreements, and it's not going to be the same investment that they might be able to produce in other places, such as Africa and other places. I don't think Lebanon is really a priority for the Chinese, frankly. It is too far away from home. It is, I would say, an overstretch for them. The Russians, I'd be a little bit more concerned. There have been, at least in the past, I'd say over the past several years, offers to the Lebanese army to work more closely with the Russians. But boy, the left is so, they have a crystal clear understanding that any entertainment of overtures, by the Russians would immediately drastically affect the relationship with us. And so for us, it's like a 0-1, right? It's either us 100% all in, and you're not going to share that partnership with anybody else, or we're out. And so I think the left understands that very well. And they also understand what Duke has mentioned before, and Dana, is that this is really beyond equipment and advice. This is really a full-fledged partnership. In order to actually reenact that elsewhere, it's going to take much more than that. And, we're not going to do that with the Russians or the Chinese. It's that simple. It's not as easy.
All right, we only have about 4 minutes left, so hopefully we can get a couple of final questions in. There is a question from Joseph Sarkis, and he is asking, is there any specific US mechanism to alleviate the financial hardship on LAF families? Dana or Duke, do you want to take that?
Well, there's not a specific U.S. mechanism, but on this, we're thinking through very much, I think, not just how we can support the LAF and LAF families, but how we can support the Lebanese people. Again, just to the earlier part of this conversation, I think what you've heard from the panelists is that we cannot emphasize enough the severity of the humanitarian crisis, the lack of key supplies, and the lack of responsiveness by the Lebanese government to take what should be very straightforward steps in order to unlock broader international assistance. So what we're thinking through in the US government is not just how we can support the LAF and LAF families so that they are able to maintain focus on our shared security objectives and commitment to the US strategic partnership, but more broadly, how we can support the Lebanese people given the dire humanitarian situation without empowering spoilers and bad actors within the Lebanese political construct.
We have, I think just this one final question from Deborah Trent. Thinking about effectiveness and trans-sectarian composition of the LAF as an institution, does it serve as an example for building institutional capacity in other Lebanese governmental institutions? Duke, do you want to take that?
Yikes.
I saw Dana reaching forward.
Dana, I don't know. Whoever wants to take it.
I'm happy to take a stab, and then I think actually Bilal probably has some thoughts on this. So what you have in the LAF is a capable, willing partner to work with us, is responsive both to US requests and, what we've talked about here is not just a matter of policy, the kinds of oversight that we conduct on our equipment and on our training, but also congressional requirements, which have not changed through Democratic and Republican administrations. I still expect to be asked all sorts of questions about Lebanese Hezbollah influence in the LAF, and also whether or not the LAF is protecting Lebanese civilians, responding without lethal force and protecting Lebanese protesters, et cetera. What we have is a useful number of programs, but what we're focused on is security cooperation. What you would need in non-military, non-security ministries is a capable, committed set cadre of leaders who were willing to work with the United States in partnership, not only participate in the numerous dialogues and bilats and transparency in terms of accounting and equipment use, et cetera, that the LAF willingly does with us, but they also agree on a basic shared notion of a shared vision for what the LAF is and a commitment to the LAF's role in Lebanese society. And I think what we're seeing in broader Lebanon right now is that ministries are divided among political parties, and political parties are paralyzed by lack of decision within the core Lebanese government, and that they're not willing to make decisions both in the interest of the people, but to engage with institutions in Europe, in the Middle East, and international organizations that could unlock that assistance. So sure, there is a possibility of that model, but what you first need is willing, capable leaders to participate in this partnership, and that's what I think we're not seeing.
And just before we close, Dana, I think I missed a message from you earlier. Was there something else you wanted to add on the political piece? No. Okay. I think I'm going to give the last word to Bilal here. And I have one final very quick question. If you could just answer within a minute, what is your response to the calls from some people in Congress that the LAF should do more to confront Hezbollah and its arsenal? I think that would be maybe an interesting note to close the conversation on.
Well, I mean, we already have discussed that. I think it's unrealistic. I think that what we are investing in Lebanon is not designed to achieve those objectives. Once we do decide to achieve those objectives, then the entirety of the program needs to be recalibrated. It's that simple. You have certain tools that we are using in Lebanon to accomplish certain objectives. Once you change the objectives, you got to change the tools. And that's not what we're doing right now.
All right.
And we shouldn't be doing that, by the way.
I want to thank Bilal and Duke and Dana for a really interesting conversation, and for everybody who weighed in the Q&A function. And thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this. And I hope everybody has a good day.